The father traded his own daughter, but the alpha vampire said, "She's worth more than you'll ever be." The silver chains bit into Alara's wrists as her father shoved her forward into the torchlit chamber, and the ancient creature seated on the obsidian throne didn't even glance up from the chess piece he was turning between pale fingers when he said, "I asked for payment, Henrik, not your daughter's life as collateral for your cowardice. Wait, before the next revelation happens. If this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To make sure you don't miss any unexpected alliances or awakened powers, subscribe and join our circle. The game is about to change. Now, back to the scene. The underground hall stretched before them like the ribcage of some forgotten beast, carved from black stone that seemed to drink the firelight rather than reflect it. Alara's bare feet scraped against the cold floor as she tried to regain her balance, the thin cotton dress she'd been sleeping in offering no protection against the damp chill that permeated the vampire's lair. Her father stood behind her, and she could hear his ragged breathing, smell the sour wine on his breath even from 3 feet away. "My lord Cassius," Henrik stammered, his voice cracking with desperation. "You said any payment. You said anything of value. She's young, healthy, untouched. Surely you misunderstand the concept of value." The vampire finally looked up, and Alara felt her breath catch despite her terror. He was beautiful in the way a winter storm was beautiful, deadly, inevitable, and utterly indifferent to human frailty. His eyes were the color of smoke and silver, ancient beyond measure, and when they settled on her face, she felt as though he could see through flesh and bone to the trembling soul beneath. "Your daughter is worth more than you'll ever be, Henrik Thorn." "Which is precisely why offering her as payment for your gambling debts is an insult to us both." Henrik's hand shot out, grabbing Alara's shoulder hard enough to bruise. "Please, my lord, I have nothing else. The farm is gone, the livestock sold, my wife's jewelry pawned. If you don't accept this, I'm a dead man. Victor's men will—" "Victor's men are already dead." Cassius set down the chess piece, a black queen, with deliberate precision. "I killed them an hour ago, when they came demanding their percentage of my territory's tribute. So you see, Henrik, your debt to the human crime syndicate is now irrelevant. Your debt to me, however, has just increased exponentially." The vampire rose from his throne, and Alara realized with a start that he was tall, easily 6.5 feet, with the kind of predatory grace that made every movement seem calculated for maximum efficiency. He wore black from head to toe, the fabric expensive but understated, and his dark hair was pulled back from a face that could have been carved from marble by a sculptor obsessed with depicting fallen angels. "You brought your daughter into my territory," Cassius continued, descending the 3 steps from his throne with impossible fluidity. "Past the border wards that burn human flesh, past the guardian stones that whisper madness into mortal minds, past the blood oak that feeds on those foolish enough to touch its bark." He stopped directly in front of Alara, so close she could feel the unnatural cold radiating from his body. "How is she unmarked?" Henrik said nothing. Alara felt his hand begin to shake on her shoulder. Cassius reached out and lifted Alara's chin with one finger, forcing her to meet his gaze. His touch was ice against her skin, but there was something else beneath it, a current of power that made her nerves sing with awareness. "How did you pass my defenses, girl?" "I sang to them." The words left Alara's mouth before she could stop them, surprising even herself. "The wards." They were screaming, and it hurt to hear, so I sang back. They quieted.
For the first time since they'd entered the chamber, something flickered in Cassius's expression. Not quite surprise, but a sharp, focused interest that made Alara's heart hammer against her ribs. Did they? It wasn't a question. The vampire's eyes narrowed slightly, and he released her chin only to catch her bound wrists, turning them to examine the silver chains. And the guardian stones? They were lonely. Alara's voice was barely a whisper now, fear and confusion warring in her chest. I could feel it, all that waiting, all that watching, so I thanked them for their service. She's mad, Henrik interjected desperately. The girl's always been odd, talking to things that aren't there, singing at all hours. But she's strong, my lord. She can work. She can... Be silent. Cassius didn't raise his voice, but the command cracked through the air like a whip, and Henrik's mouth snapped shut mid-sentence. The vampire's attention remained fixed on Alara. And the blood oak? Alara swallowed hard, remembering the ancient tree at the final border of the vampire's domain, its bark the color of dried blood, its branches bare despite the summer warmth. She'd felt its hunger as they approached, a yawning emptiness that wanted to consume everything it touched. I told it that I understood hunger, that I knew what it was to always be empty, no matter how much you took in. It let us pass. Cassius was silent for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made Alara feel like a manuscript being translated by a scholar who spoke dead languages. Then, slowly, he smiled. It was not a comforting expression. Henrik Thorn, the vampire said softly, still looking at Alara. Do you have any idea what you've brought me? A daughter, my lord. A payment. Whatever you wish her to be. A null. Cassius released Alara's wrists and stepped back, but his gaze never left her face.
One who walks between worlds without belonging to either. One who speaks to magic as though it were merely another form of conversation. He turned to Henrik with an expression of such cold contempt that the older man actually stumbled backward. Your daughter is the rarest thing to be born in 3 centuries, and you would trade her like a sack of grain to settle a debt of, what, 5,000 marks? Henrik's face had gone ashen. I didn't know. I swear, my lord, I didn't. Of course you didn't know. You're too busy drowning in wine and self-pity to notice anything beyond your own reflection. Cassius moved back to his throne, settling into it with the casual authority of someone who'd been giving commands since before Henrik's great-grandfather was born. Here is my judgment. Your daughter will remain with me, not as payment, but as my guest and pupil. She will learn to control her gifts, to understand what she is. You will return to your pitiful farm and live with the knowledge that you attempted to sell the one pure thing in your miserable existence. But the debt is paid. Cassius made a dismissive gesture. I'll have my people deliver enough gold to your property to settle your accounts and rebuild your holdings. What you do with that second chance is entirely your concern. But if you ever approach these borders again, if you ever attempt to contact your daughter or claim any right to her presence, I will take great pleasure in demonstrating why humans invented the word vampire as a curse. Henrik stood frozen, his face cycling through shock, relief, and something that might have been shame. He looked at Alara, opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Without another word, he turned and fled up the stone corridor, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space until they faded to nothing. Alara remained where she was, bound and barefoot, and utterly bewildered. She was alone now with a creature that could kill her with a thought, in a place so far from anything she'd known that she might as well have crossed into another world entirely. And yet, why? She asked, her voice steadier than she'd expected. Cassius tilted his head slightly, a gesture that reminded her of a predator assessing prey. Why, what, precisely? Why not just kill us both? Why let him go? Why, she swallowed hard, forcing the next words out. Why call me a guest when we both know I'm a prisoner? Perceptive. The vampire rose again, but this time when he approached, his movements were less predatory, more curious. He stopped a respectful distance away and produced a small key from his pocket. Your wrists, may I? Ilara extended her bound hands, and Cassius unlocked the silver chains with practiced efficiency. The metal had left red marks on her skin, and she rubbed at them absently as the vampire pocketed the key and chains. To answer your questions in order, Cassius said, I didn't kill you both because murder is tedious when it's not necessary, and your father is more useful alive and terrified than dead and forgotten. I let him go because his presence was an irritation, and I dislike being irritated in my own home. As for why I call you a guest, he paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. You are not my prisoner, Ilara Thorne. You are free to leave at any time. However, I suspect that within 3 days of departing my protection, you'll be captured by those who hunt your kind for profit or experimentation. Within a week, you'll either be dead or wishing you were. So while the door remains unlocked, I suspect you'll choose to walk through it only when you understand how to survive what waits on the other side. The casual assessment of her potential doom should have terrified Ilara. Instead, she felt a strange sort of relief. At least he was being honest. What's a null? She asked.
A human born with the ability to interact with magical entities as equals rather than as prey or obstacles. You don't just see or sense magic, Cassius gestured vaguely, as if searching for the right description. You speak its language natively. To a ward, you're not an intruder to be burned, you're a fellow worker. To a guardian stone, you're not a threat to be driven mad, you're a kindred spirit. It's extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily dangerous for the null in question. Why dangerous? Because every supernatural faction in existence would love to own you. Vampires could use you to navigate enemy territories. Witches could use you to amplify their spells. Hunters could use you to find and disable protective magic. You are, essentially, a skeleton key that walks and talks and bleeds. Cassius's expression hardened. And you've been living in a farming village with no training, no protection, and a father too drunk to notice he'd spawned a miracle. Ilara absorbed this in silence. It explained so much, the way she'd always felt slightly out of step with the world, the voices she heard in empty rooms, the sense that the boundaries other people perceived were merely suggestions to her. She'd thought herself mad for years. Knowing there was a reason, a name for what she was should have been comforting. Instead, she felt the weight of a target settling onto her back. So, you intend to train me? She said slowly. To what end? To the end of you surviving past your 19th birthday. Cassius moved to a side table where a crystal decanter held what looked like very expensive wine. He poured a single glass and returned to offer it to her. And perhaps, if you prove capable, to the end of you becoming someone who can't be used, someone who can't be owned, someone who makes her own choices about where her loyalties lie. Ilara took the glass, but didn't drink. And what would you want in return for this training? The vampire smiled again, and this time there was a hint of approval in the expression. Clever girl. Yes, there's always a price. Mine is this. While you train under my protection, you will use your gifts to help me solve a problem that's been plaguing my territory for the past 6 months. What kind of problem? Someone is killing my people. Cassius's voice remained even, but there was a cold fury beneath the words. Not the random violence of hunters or rival covens, but systematic executions. Each victim is found drained entirely of blood, their hearts removed, and a symbol carved into their foreheads. 7 dead so far, all of them vampires who'd lived in my territory for decades. No witnesses, no evidence beyond the bodies themselves. And you think I can help find the killer? I think you're the only one who can, because the symbols carved into their foreheads are ward markers, old ones, the kind that specifically target vampires while leaving humans and other supernaturals untouched. Cassius drained his own wineglass and set it down with careful precision. Someone with extensive knowledge of protective magic is hunting my coven, and they're doing it from inside the very boundaries I've established to keep my people safe. I need to know how they're bypassing my defenses. I need to understand the ward work well enough to counter it. And I can do that, Elara said slowly, because ward work is magic you can speak to. Yes, you could potentially trace the wards back to their creator, or at minimum, explain to me how they function, well enough that I can develop countermeasures. Cassius met her gaze directly. I won't lie to you, Elara. This will be dangerous. The killer is skilled, ruthless, and clearly has no qualms about adding a null to their body count if you get too close. But if you help me stop them, I guarantee you'll have the training and protection necessary to make your own way in this world. And a vampire's guarantee, unlike a human's promise, is binding unto death. Elara looked down at the wine in her glass, watching the torchlight refract through the dark liquid. A day ago, she'd been nothing, the strange daughter of a failing farmer, destined for a life of poverty and eventual marriage to whoever would take her off her father's hands. Now she was apparently a miracle and a target, standing in a vampire's lair and negotiating the terms of her own education in exchange for hunting a serial killer. It was, objectively, insane. It was also the first time in her life that someone had looked at her and seen value rather than inconvenience. I have conditions, she said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. Cassius raised an eyebrow. Do you? I want it in writing, this agreement, whatever training you provide, whatever protection you offer, and whatever you expect in return. I want it formalized. Elara set the wineglass down untouched. And I want it witnessed by a neutral party, someone who can verify you're not binding me into servitude with clever wording. The vampire was quiet for a long moment, studying her with that same unsettling intensity. Then, slowly, he began to laugh. It was a rusty sound, as though he didn't use it often, but there was genuine amusement in it. Your father calls you odd, Cassius said when his laughter subsided. I call you remarkably intelligent. Very well, Elara Thorne. We'll draft a contract, and I'll summon the archive keeper to witness its signing. She's about as neutral as entities get, and she has no love for either vampires or humans, so she'll have no reason to favor one of us over the other. He extended his hand. Do we have an accord? Elara looked at the offered hand, pale, cold, belonging to a creature that had lived for centuries and killed for even longer. Then she thought about her father's face as he'd shoved her forward, the casual way he'd tried to trade her life for his deaths. She thought about the voices she'd heard all her life, the magic that sang in her bones, the sense that she'd been waiting for something without knowing what it was. She reached out and clasped Cassius's hand. His skin was ice against hers, but his grip was firm and respectful. We have an accord, she said. Excellent. Cassius released her hand and turned toward a corridor that branched off from the main chamber. Come, I'll show you to your quarters, and then we'll begin. The sooner you understand what you are, the sooner we can catch a killer and ensure you live long enough to make use of that considerable will of yours." As Ilara followed the vampire deeper into his underground domain, she felt the weight of her old life falling away like a discarded skin. There was fear, yes, she wasn't fool enough to ignore the danger she was walking into. But beneath the fear was something else, something that had been sleeping in her chest for 19 years and was only now beginning to wake. Purpose, possibility, power. The game, as Cassius might say, had changed, and Ilara Thorne intended to learn all its rules. The Archive Keeper arrived at midnight, which Cassius had dryly informed Ilara was the only time the ancient entity agreed to make house calls. They'd spent the intervening hours in what the vampire called his study, a vast circular room whose walls were lined with books that predated the printing press, scrolls whose edges crumbled at the slightest vibration, and tablets carved with languages Ilara couldn't begin to identify. "The contract must be precise," Cassius explained, as he wrote in careful script on parchment that looked suspiciously like skin. "The Archive Keeper will verify that neither of us is being coerced and that the terms are equitable. She won't, however, prevent us from making a bad bargain willingly, so read every word 3 times before you sign." Ilara leaned over the desk, studying the emerging document. Cassius's handwriting was beautiful, each letter formed with the kind of precision that came from centuries of practice. The contract outlined her training schedule, the limits of Cassius' authority over her movements, her obligations regarding the investigation, and the specific protections he would provide. "This clause," Ilara said, pointing to a section near the bottom, "what does full autonomy restored upon completion or termination mean exactly?" "It means that once the killer is caught, or you decide to end your training for any reason, you're free to go. No magical compulsions, no blood bonds, no obligations beyond basic courtesy." Cassius glanced up from his writing. "I don't deal in slavery, Ilara. I've lived long enough to know that unwilling servants inevitably become enemies, and I have enough of those already. And this part about reasonable protection against external threats? I can't make you immortal or invincible, but I can ensure that anyone attempting to harm or capture you while you're under my roof will regret their choices profoundly. Additionally, I'll teach you basic defensive techniques and provide you with artifacts that will keep you safe when you're working independently." Ilara continued reading, checking each clause against her limited understanding of contract law. She'd learned to read from the village priest, who'd taken pity on her when her father couldn't afford schooling, but legal terminology was mostly beyond her. Still, the language seemed straightforward enough. Cassius was offering training, protection, and compensation in exchange for her help finding the killer. No hidden clauses about eternal servitude, no suspicious gaps that could be exploited later. "I think it's fair," she said finally. Cassius signed his name with a flourish and set down his pen. "Now we wait for—" The temperature in the room dropped 30 degrees in an instant. The candles guttered and went out, plunging them into absolute darkness. And then, slowly, light returned, but not from any natural source. The air itself seemed to luminesce with a pale blue glow that cast no shadows and offered no warmth. A figure stood in the center of the room where moments before there had been only empty space. She was tall and slender, wrapped in robes that seemed to be woven from fog and starlight. Her face was ageless and serene, with features that suggested no particular ethnicity, but rather a perfect amalgamation of human beauty. But her eyes were entirely black. No white, no iris, just endless depth that suggested she saw far more than the surface of things. "Cassius Mortain," the Archive Keeper said, her voice like wind through empty halls. "You summon me for a contract signing. This is irregular even for you." Irregular circumstances require irregular responses. Cassius gestured to Ilara. This is Ilara Thorn. She's a null, untrained, and recently rescued from her own father's stupidity. We're formalizing an agreement that will keep her alive long enough to learn what she is. Those bottomless black eyes turned to Ilara, and she felt the weight of the archive keeper's attention like a physical pressure. It wasn't hostile, but it was absolute, as though every secret Ilara had ever kept, every lie she'd ever told, every hope she'd ever harbored was being catalogued and filed for future reference. "A null," the archive keeper murmured. "I haven't witnessed one of your kind in 70 years. The last one died badly, torn apart by wolf shifters who wanted to use her gifts to hunt vampire territories." Her head tilted slightly. "You understand the danger you're in, child." "I'm beginning to," Ilara managed. "Good. Fear is healthy when it's proportionate to threat." The archive keeper extended one hand, and the contract lifted from Cassius's desk to float through the air and settle in her palm. She read it in silence, those black eyes tracking across the text with inhuman speed. The terms are equitable. Neither party is coerced. The compensation is fair given the risks involved. I see no deception in the wording. "Then you'll witness?" Cassius asked. "I will, but first a question for the null." The archive keeper lowered the contract and fixed Ilara with that penetrating stare. "Why accept this bargain? You could flee, find a human city, lose yourself in the crowds, live an ordinary life. Why choose to walk further into danger?" Ilara considered her answer carefully. This entity clearly valued truth, and anything less would be immediately apparent. "Because running means staying ignorant," she said finally. "And ignorance is what almost got me killed tonight. My father offered me to a vampire because he didn't understand what I was. I crossed magical borders without harm because I didn't know they should have killed me. I've spent 19 years being afraid of my own mind because no one could explain what I was experiencing." She met those black eyes steadily. "I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of powerless. And I'm tired of pretending I'm something I'm not just to make other people comfortable. So yes, this is dangerous, but at least it's dangerous with purpose." The archive keeper was silent for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, she smiled. "Cassius Martain, you have found yourself either the finest pupil you'll ever train, or the death of you. Possibly both. I look forward to recording which outcome manifests." With that cryptic pronouncement, she placed the contract back on the desk. A quill appeared in her hand, not a normal pen, but something that seemed carved from pure shadow. And she signed her name at the bottom in script that glowed with that same pale blue light. "The archive bears witness. This contract is binding." Cassius signed next, his name appearing in red ink that Ilara suspected wasn't ink at all. Then the vampire slid the contract across to her, offering her a normal quill and black ink. Ilara picked up the pen, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her shoulders. This was it. The moment she stopped being her father's daughter and became something else, someone else. She thought about all the years of feeling wrong, of not quite fitting, of voices in empty rooms and songs that had no source. She thought about the wards that had quieted at her touch, the stones that had welcomed her, the tree that had understood her hunger. She signed her name in careful letters, Ilara Thorn. The moment the pen left the parchment, the contract flared with brilliant white light. Ilara felt something settle into her chest, not painful, but present. A sense of connection, of binding,
of promises made and witnessed by powers far older than human law. It is done. The archive keeper rolled the contract and tucked it into her robes, where it vanished entirely. I will hold this in my vault until such time as its terms are fulfilled or broken. May you both find what you seek in this bargain. She vanished as suddenly as she'd appeared, taking the strange blue luminescence with her. The candles relit themselves, and the temperature returned to its previous chill. Ilara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Well," Cassius said, sounding faintly amused, "that went better than expected. She didn't threaten either of us even once." "Does she usually threaten people?" "The archive keeper considers emotional displays beneath her dignity, but she has been known to make pointed observations of the inevitable consequences of foolish choices. The fact that she smiled at you is practically a ringing endorsement." The vampire stood and stretched, a gesture so human it momentarily made Ilara forget what he was. "Come, it's late, you're exhausted, and we have significant work ahead of us. I'll show you to your rooms." Ilara followed him through corridors that twisted and branched like the veins of some massive organism. The underground complex was far larger than Shed realized, with chambers opening onto other chambers, staircases spiraling up and down, and doorways that led to spaces that shouldn't have been able to exist given the architecture around them. "Don't try to memorize the layout," Cassius advised, when he noticed her craning her neck to map their route. "The structure shifts, not dramatically, but enough that you'll confuse yourself trying to hold it all in your head. Just learn the key landmarks and trust your instincts." "The structure shifts. Why?" "Because I built it too. Intruders who manage to breach my borders find themselves walking in circles until they either give up or I find them. My people, however, can navigate perfectly well because the Warren recognizes friendly intent." He glanced back at her. "You, as of tonight, are registered as friendly. The passages will lead you where you need to go." They climbed a spiral staircase that seemed to go on forever, until finally emerging into a corridor that looked less like carved stone and more like an actual house. The floor was polished wood, the walls hung with tapestries, and actual windows looked out onto what appeared to be a garden. "Wait," Ilara said, stopping to stare. "Windows? But we're underground." "Are we?" Cassius smiled at her confusion. "The definition of underground gets flexible when you're dealing with spaces designed by someone who's had 400 years to study dimensional architecture. Those windows look out on the garden level, which exists partially in the world you know and partially in several others. It makes for excellent defensive positioning and even better views." He led her to a door near the end of the corridor and pushed it open. "Your quarters. Bed, bath, wardrobe, writing desk, and a small library to start. If you need anything else, just speak it aloud. The room hears." Ilara stepped inside and felt her breath catch. The room was beautiful. Not ostentatious, but comfortable in a way she'd never experienced. The bed was large and piled with quilts and pillows. The windows did indeed look out on a moonlit garden where impossible flowers bloomed in shades of silver and violet. The bathroom, visible through an open door, contained an actual porcelain tub, and the wardrobe stood open to reveal dresses and practical clothing in her size. "How did you—" she started. "I have staff who are very efficient." Cassius leaned against the doorframe, watching her take it all in. "The library is stocked with basics: magical theory, null histories, defensive techniques. Start with whatever interests you. We'll begin formal training tomorrow at sunset." "Sunset? I'm a vampire, Ilara. I don't do mornings." The dry humor in his voice made her smile despite her exhaustion. "Get some rest. You've had an eventful night." He turned to leave, but Ilara called out, "Cassius!" The vampire paused, looking back over his shoulder.
"Thank you," she said, "for not accepting my father's offer, for seeing me as more than payment." Something shifted in Cassius' expression, a brief glimpse of something almost vulnerable beneath the ancient predator's mask. "Your father is a fool, Ilara Thorn, but his foolishness led you to my door, and I suspect that may prove to be the most interesting thing to either of us in quite some time." He inclined his head slightly. "Sleep well. Tomorrow we begin teaching you to survive." Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Ilara stood alone in her new room, in the vampire's warren, in a life that bore no resemblance to anything she'd known just hours before. She should have been terrified. She should have been planning her escape. Instead, she walked to the window and looked out at the impossible garden, listening to the faint song of magic that hummed through the walls and floor and air itself. It was the same song she'd been hearing all her life, but now she was finally beginning to understand the words. She had made her choice, signed her name, bound herself to an accord that would either kill her or transform her into something entirely new. Ilara pressed her palm against the cool glass and smiled. Let the transformation begin. The first body had been discovered 3 weeks before Ilara's arrival, though she wouldn't learn the details until her 3rd day in the warren. Cassius believed in establishing foundations before introducing complications, so her initial lessons focused on understanding what she was rather than immediately throwing her into an investigation. "Magic is language," Cassius explained, as they stood in his training room, a circular chamber whose walls were inscribed with thousands of symbols in dozens of different magical alphabets. And like any language, it has grammar, syntax, and vocabulary. Most humans can't perceive magical language at all. Those with minor gifts might hear fragments, a word here, a phrase there. But nulls like you're fluent speakers from birth. You just never knew it. Ilara walked slowly around the room, her fingers trailing just above the inscribed symbols. She could feel each one, not physically, but as a kind of pressure against her awareness. Some hummed with active power, others lay dormant, and a few pulsed with what felt almost like curiosity. "This one is asking what I want," she said, pausing before a complex glyph that seemed to shift slightly when she looked at it directly. "Correct. That's a ward of permission. It will grant or deny access based on intent." Cassius moved to stand beside her. "Try responding to it. Not out loud, but with your mind. Form an intention and project it at the symbol." Ilara focused on the glyph, thinking clearly. "I want to understand you." The symbol flared brilliant gold for just an instant, and suddenly, Ilara wasn't standing in the training room anymore. She was standing in a field of wheat under an autumn sun, watching a woman with silver hair draw the symbol into the dirt with a stick. The woman was speaking, and though Ilara didn't recognize the language, she understood it perfectly. "Let this mark know friend from foe, and may it guard the harvest from those who would take without asking." Then she was back in the training room, gasping slightly, her hand pressed to her chest. "What was that?" she demanded. "The symbol's memory." Cassius looked pleased. "You asked to understand it, so it showed you its creation, its purpose, and the intent of its maker. Most magic users never achieve that level of communication. They can activate wards, yes, but they don't converse with them. You, however," he gestured to the glowing symbol, "you just made a friend." Over the following days, Ilara learned to speak with wards, to negotiate with protection spells, to ask guardians what they were guarding and why. She discovered that magic, far from being the cold, impersonal force she'd imagined, was actually deeply relational. Every spell, every ward, every enchantment had been created by someone for a specific purpose, and that purpose left an imprint that she could read like text. "The killer's wards," she said one evening, as she and Cassius took dinner in his private chambers. He didn't eat, of course, but he kept her company while she worked through a meal of roasted chicken and vegetables that appeared to have been prepared by someone who actually understood seasoning. "If they're carved into the victims, can I speak with them?" "Theoretically, yes. In practice," Cassius swirled wine in his glass, staring into it with an expression of deep frustration. "The wards disappear within hours of the bodies being discovered. Not damaged or disabled, they simply cease to exist, as though they were never there." "We've tried everything to preserve them. Magical stasis fields, temporal loops, even having our best ward workers sketch copies. Nothing works. The moment the ward has served its purpose, it vanishes." "That's unusual? That's unheard of. Wards persist unless actively dispelled or unless their power source is exhausted. These are doing neither. They're self-destructing on a timer, which requires a level of sophistication in ward construction that should be impossible for a human practitioner." "Why do you assume the killer is human?" Cassius set down his wine glass with particular care. "Because vampires can't work wards that target other vampires. It's a fundamental rule of magical sympathy. Like can't harm like through indirect means. A vampire can kill another vampire directly, with fang and claw and sword, but they can't craft a ward that specifically burns vampire flesh. The magic simply won't cooperate." "But a null could," Elara said slowly, understanding dawning. "If magic responds to intent and purpose, and if a null speaks the language natively, then yes, theoretically, a null could craft wards that break the normal rules, which is one of many reasons why your kind is so sought after and so dangerous." Cassius leaned back in his chair, studying her. "But there hasn't been another null in this region for decades. They're rare enough that when one emerges, the news spreads quickly. Unless someone has been hiding their nature, which is possible, but difficult. Or unless they're newly awakened," Elara offered. "I didn't know what I was until tonight. Maybe someone else has been stumbling through their abilities, and they've decided to use them for murder." A grim thought, but plausible. Cassius rose from his chair and moved to the window, looking out at his impossible garden. "The first victim was Marcus. He'd been with me for 83 years, a scholar who specialized in ancient texts." Found in his study with the ward carved so precisely into his forehead it looked like it had been there since birth. The second was Elena, a musician who performed in the human city under glamour. Third was James, one of my border guards. Then Sophia, Thomas, David, and most recently, Catherine. Any connection between them? Shared enemies, old debts, romantic entanglements? We've looked. Marcus and Elena never spoke. James and Sophia were friends, but nothing more. Thomas was a recluse who spent most of his time in the deep archives. David was new to the territory, only been here 5 years. Catherine. Cassius's voice tightened almost imperceptibly. Catherine was my second in command. If anyone knew all my secrets, it was her. And she was killed in her own rooms, behind wards that should have prevented anyone from entering without invitation. "I'm sorry," Elara said quietly. "Don't be. Sorry is for friends and family. Catherine was a colleague I respected and will miss, but I've lost too many people over the centuries to indulge in grief." The vampire turned back to face her, and his expression was all cold fury again. "What I want is justice. And answers, in whichever order they arrive." Elara pushed her plate aside and stood. "Then I should examine the next crime scene, while the body is still fresh and the ward is still intact." Cassius's expression shifted to something almost like respect. "That would require you to be present when the killer strikes again." "Yes, you understand that puts you directly in the killer's path? That if they discover what you are, you become either a target or a prize?" "I understand." Elara met his gaze steadily. "But I can't learn how the wards work from descriptions and sketches. I need to see one active, speak to it directly, understand its purpose before it self-destructs. And if the killer is another null, I need to know. Because if they are, and if they've decided that vampires are the enemy.
She let the thought hang unfinished. Then they won't stop until my entire coven is ash and memory. Cassius nodded slowly. Very well. I'll increase patrols and establish better communication networks. The moment a body is discovered, you'll be notified. But Alara, I need you to promise me something. What? That you won't try to confront the killer alone. Observe, document, learn, but don't engage. Your gifts make you powerful in some ways and catastrophically vulnerable in others. Until you've had more training, direct confrontation would likely end with you as the next victim. It was a reasonable request, and yet Ilara felt a flicker of resistance. She'd spent her whole life being told what she couldn't do, what she wasn't capable of, what she needed to be protected from. But Cassius's concern seemed genuine rather than condescending, and more importantly, he was probably right. She'd barely begun to understand her abilities. Overconfidence would get her killed. I promise, she said. No confrontations. Good. Cassius moved toward the door. Now come, I want to show you the memorial wall before we continue with ward theory. You should see the faces of those we're seeking justice for. The memorial wall occupied an entire section of the Warrens' public chambers, a vast space where Cassius's coven apparently gathered for important meetings and ceremonies. The wall itself was black marble, and carved into it were hundreds of names, dates, and occasionally small portraits. Vampires who had lived in this territory contributed to its protection and eventually met their final deaths. The 7 most recent additions were marked with fresh gold leaf, their names standing out in brilliant contrast to the weathered inscriptions around them. Cassius stopped before them, and for a long moment he simply stood in silence. Marcus loved terrible jokes, he said finally, the kind that make you groan rather than laugh. He collected them from every era he lived through. Elena could make a violin weep or sing with equal skill, and she never let anyone forget that music was the one art vampires contributed to rather than stolen from humanity. James was terrified of spires, despite being strong enough to tear a grown man in half. Sophia had been working on a treatise about blood magic for 30 years and was convinced she was on the verge of a breakthrough. Thomas could speak 17 languages, 3 of them dead. David. Cassius paused, his jaw tightening. David reminded me that not all vampires are ancient monsters. He was turned only 15 years ago, still remembered what it was like to be human, still tried to hold on to that humanity, even as it slipped away. And Catherine? Ilara asked gently. Catherine was the reason this coven survived the purges of 1802. She was the one who convinced me that hiding wasn't the same as cowardice, that sometimes the best way to protect your people is to avoid the fight entirely. She was brilliant, pragmatic, and ruthlessly efficient, and someone walked past her defenses like they were made of paper and killed her in her sleep. Cassius' hand came up to touch Catherine's name, his fingers tracing the letters. She deserved better than that. Ilara studied the names, committing each one to memory. These weren't just victims, they were people with histories, quirks, dreams, and relationships. Finding their killer wasn't just solving a puzzle or fulfilling her contract. It was about honoring lives that had been stolen. I'll find them, she said. Whoever did this, whatever their reasons, I'll find them. Cassius lowered his hand and turned to look at her. I believe you will. The question is what we'll discover when you do. Because whoever is doing this isn't just skilled, they're methodical, they're patient, and they're escalating. 7 deaths in 6 months means the next one could happen any day now.
As summoned by his words, a young vampire burst into the chamber, her eyes wide with fear and her movements sharp with urgency. "My lord," she gasped, "another body! In the East Gardens! It's Peter!" Cassius' entire demeanor shifted in an instant, the contemplative scholar vanishing behind the cold mask of the Alpha. When? "We don't know. He was found 10 minutes ago, during routine patrol. The ward is still glowing." Ilara felt her heart rate spike. This was it. Her chance to see the killer's work firsthand, to speak with the ward before it vanished into nothing. "Show us," Cassius commanded, already moving toward the door. He glanced back at Ilara. "Stay close. Don't touch anything until I've secured the scene. And remember your promise." They ran through the corridors, the young vampire leading the way with supernatural speed that Ilara couldn't hope to match. Cassius noticed her struggling to keep up and, without breaking stride, simply scooped her into his arms and accelerated. The world became a blur of stone and torchlight, and then they were outside, in a garden that shouldn't have existed underground, but somehow did. Its plants heavy with night-blooming flowers, and its paths lit by luminescent stones. A cluster of vampires stood around something on the ground, their faces grim. They parted as Cassius approached, revealing the body. Peter had been young when he was turned, perhaps 25, with sandy hair and the kind of pleasant, forgettable features that made him easy to overlook. Now his eyes stared sightlessly at the impossible stars above, his chest cavity open and empty where his heart should have been. And carved into his forehead with surgical precision was a symbol that glowed with sickly green light. Ilara felt the ward's presence before she even looked at it directly, a cold, hateful thing that radiated focused malice. This wasn't protective magic or defensive work. This was a weapon designed specifically to kill.
"Clear the area," Cassius ordered, his voice flat and dangerous. "Standard search pattern, 20-meter radius. Look for anything unusual. Footprints, broken branches, blood that isn't Peter's. And someone notify his maker. She deserves to know." The vampires dispersed with military efficiency, leaving Cassius and Ilara alone with the body. The Alpha crouched beside Peter, his hand hovering over the dead vampire's chest with something that might have been tenderness. "He was kind," Cassius said quietly. "Not brilliant or powerful or particularly ambitious, just kind. He helped in the gardens, took care of the animals we keep for the newer vampires who still struggle with hunting, made sure everyone felt welcome at gatherings." His hand clenched into a fist, and someone ripped his heart out and left him like discarded trash. Ilara knelt on the other side of the body, her attention fixed on the glowing ward. Up close, she could see that it was impossibly complex. Dozens of interlocking symbols woven together in a pattern that should have been too dense to function. But it was functioning. It was radiating power like a miniature sun. "I need to touch it," she said. "Ilara, I know it's dangerous, but if I don't communicate with it now, while it's active, we lose our chance to understand how it works." She looked up at Cassius. "You said the wards vanish within hours. We don't have time to debate this." Cassius held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once, sharply. "Do it, but if you start to show any signs of distress, I'm pulling you away. Clear?" "Clear." Ilara reached out slowly, her fingers hovering just above the glowing symbol. She could feel its heat, not physical warmth, but magical energy that made her skin prickle. She took a breath, centered herself the way Cassius had taught her, and made contact. The world exploded into sensation. She was standing in a workshop she didn't recognize, watching hands she didn't own carve symbols into a piece of bone. The hands were scarred, the fingers stained with old blood,
and they moved with the kind of precision that came from years of practice. A voice, female, bitter, exhausted, spoke words in a language Elara almost understood. For every life you stole, for every future you ended, for every person who begged for mercy you didn't give, let this mark burn away the rot at the root. The vision shifted. Now she was standing over Peter's body, looking down at him with eyes that weren't hers. And she felt, God, she felt the killer's emotions like they were her own. Rage, grief, a soul-deep weariness that came from carrying impossible weight for too long. And underneath it all, a conviction so absolute it felt like gravity. They deserved this, every single one of them. Justice delayed is justice denied, and I am the reckoning they've earned. Elara tried to pull back, tried to break the connection, but the ward held her fast. It wanted to show her more, wanted her to understand. Images flickered past in rapid succession. A young girl with dark hair, laughing in sunlight. The same girl, older, running through woods at night, terror on her face. Vampires, 3 of them, hunting her like prey. The girl cornered, screaming, begging. Elara felt someone grab her shoulders and yank her backward. The connection broke with a sensation like tearing fabric, and she collapsed against Cassius' chest, gasping and shaking. "What did you see?" the Alpha demanded, his arms supporting her weight. "Elara, what did the ward show you?" "The killer," she managed, her voice hoarse. "It's a woman. Human, I think, or at least she was. She's not killing for pleasure or profit. She's killing for revenge. Someone hurt someone she loved. Vampires hurt someone she loved, and she's decided that your entire coven is responsible." Cassius' expression went very still. "Did you see her face?" "No, just her hands. And—"
Elara closed her eyes, trying to hold on to the details before they faded like dreams. She's skilled, really skilled. Those wards aren't just functional, they're masterwork. And she's been doing this long enough that carving them is muscle memory. So, we're looking for a human ward worker with a personal vendetta and enough skill to bypass my defenses. Cassius helped Elara to her feet, steadying her when she swayed. That narrows it down to perhaps 24 people in the region, maybe fewer if we eliminate those who don't fit the profile. There's more. Elara forced herself to focus past the lingering vertigo from the vision. The ward showed me a memory, a girl being hunted by vampires. I think that's what triggered this. The killer isn't just angry, she's grieving. Someone was taken from her, and now she's making your people pay. How long ago was this memory? I don't know. Years, maybe? The girl looked young, 16 or 17. But the killer's hands were older. This didn't just happen. Cassius released her and turned back to Peter's body, his expression thoughtful. So, we're dealing with someone who's been carrying this rage for years, who only recently acquired the skills necessary to act on it, and who's systematic enough to target specific members of my coven rather than simply attacking random vampires. He crouched again, examining the ward symbol. Can you tell if she's a null? Elara stepped closer, fighting the urge to touch the ward again. Even without physical contact, she could feel its structure, the way the magic was woven and bound. I don't think so. A null would speak to the magic, negotiate with it. This feels more like— she searched for the right comparison. Like she's commanding it, forcing it into the shape she needs through sheer will and technical skill. A master ward worker, then. Not a null, but extraordinarily talented. Cassius straightened and looked at Elara.
That's actually worse.
A con we could potentially reason with, make them understand that they're being used or manipulated. A human practitioner with this level of skill and this much hate? He shook his head. They've made their choice. They won't stop until they're dead, or we are. The ward flickered suddenly, its glow fading. Elara watched as the symbol that had been carved with such precision began to dissolve, the lines blurring and then vanishing entirely. Within 60 seconds, there was no trace of magic left on Peter's forehead, just the physical wound of the carving itself, which would fade as the body properly died and turned to ash. "It's gone," she said unnecessarily. "As they always are." Cassius signaled to the vampires who'd been searching the perimeter. "Anything?" "No footprints, no trace, no scent we don't recognize," one of them reported. "Whoever did this either flew in and out or is good enough to mask their presence completely." "Or they're still here," Cassius said quietly, his eyes scanning the garden with predatory focus, watching, waiting to see our response. His voice rose slightly, carrying across the open space. "If you're listening, killer, know this. I will find you. I will learn your name, your face, your every secret. And when I do, you'll discover that the monsters you've been hunting are capable of far worse than anything you've imagined." The garden remained silent, except for the whisper of wind through impossible leaves. Elara felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. Because Cassius was right, the killer could be anywhere. And if they'd seen her touch the ward, if they'd realized what she was, she'd just painted a target on her own back. The investigation consumed the following weeks with an intensity that left Elara exhausted in ways she'd never experienced. Cassius proved to be a demanding teacher, but a thorough one, balancing her ward training with lessons in vampire politics, regional history, and the delicate art of magical investigation. "Everyone is a suspect until proven otherwise," he explained as they reviewed files in his study. "That's not paranoia, that's survival. Someone is bypassing my defenses, killing my people in their own homes, and leaving no evidence beyond a vanishing ward. That level of access suggests either spectacular skill or inside help, possibly both." They interviewed every member of the Coven, documented their whereabouts during each murder, and cross-referenced their testimonies against known facts. Elara learned to read vampire body language, the subtle tells that suggested deception, the micro-expressions that lingered even when glamour tried to hide them. She also learned that vampires, despite their reputation, were not particularly good liars when confronted by someone who could see through supernatural manipulation. "It's because we're used to being the top predator," Cassius said when she mentioned this. "We rely on fear and power to get our way. Actually lying convincingly requires practice most of us never bother to develop." They ruled out 17 vampires in the first week. Too young, too distant during key murders, or too genuinely devastated by the deaths to fake their grief. The remaining suspects formed an uncomfortable list. 6 vampires who'd been in the territory long enough to know its secrets, had the access necessary to move freely, and harbored enough darkness in their histories to make motivation plausible. "I don't want it to be any of them," Cassius admitted one evening as they sat in his garden, surrounded by flowers that glowed faintly in the darkness. "These are people I've known for decades, people I've trusted with my life and the lives of others." He trailed off, staring into his wine. "Maybe none of them are," Elara offered. "Maybe the killer really is just that good." "Maybe. But good doesn't explain Catherine's death. Her rooms were warded against entry by anyone except me and a handful of others. For the killer to reach her, they either had her permission or they had help from someone she trusted implicitly. It was a grim calculus, and it got grimmer when 2 more bodies appeared in rapid succession. First was Gabriel, a warrior who'd survived 3 major battles and dozens of minor skirmishes, found in the training hall with the familiar ward carved into his forehead. Then, just 4 days later, Miranda, a researcher who specialized in magical theory, discovered in the library surrounded by her books. 9 victims. 9 symbols that showed Ilara the same hands, the same bitter determination, the same absolute conviction that justice was being served. "She's accelerating," Ilara said after examining Miranda's body. The gap between Peter and Gabriel was 12 days. Gabriel to Miranda was only 4. She's either getting more confident or more desperate, or she's running out of time. Cassius paced the library like a caged predator. Maybe she knows we're closing in. Maybe she's trying to finish her list before we stop her. What list? That's what we need to determine, because I don't believe these victims are random. There has to be a connection we're missing.